I'd like to say a huge welcome to everybody for the the BSA Friends event this evening. For those unfamiliar with the BSA, we're a UK-based charity whose object is to conduct, facilitate and promote research in Greece in all periods and across all arts, humanities and social science disciplines. We do this from the main base in Athens and also a satellite base in Knossos, where Amy has spent a considerable amount of time doing her research as well. We've also got an office in London, and Flora, who's on the call too, heads up the office in London. Mary Christine is the chairperson of the BSA Friends, and we're very grateful to them for all the work that they do. You're looking actually at a screenshot, I think, of the BSA, yes, of the BSA website, and you're very welcome to visit that, explore the website, and also consider signing up for our mailing list as well, where you can receive information about our activities, including future events like this, and perhaps even become one of our supporters. So just before I hand over to Mary Christine, who will introduce Amy, there are a few protocols that I hope will help the event run smoothly. Other than the speaker and Mary Christine as host, all microphones are off by default. Throughout the talk, there are two functions available. There's the chat button at the bottom and the Q&A, which are the two speech bubbles at the bottom. Now, the chat feature allows you to type text which can be read by other participants, as well as the lecturer and host. And actually, this is what you type in if you're experiencing any problems, any issues with sound or anything like that, and Flora or I should be able to help you with that. And then the Q&A feature, which looks like two chat bubbles, one on top of each other, are the space in which you can type questions for the speaker, and only you, the speaker, and the host can see those. And after the lecture finishes, Marie Christine will read out a selection of the questions for Amy. You should see a small window in the top right-hand part of your screen. If you want to get rid of that, you can mouse over it and move it around your screen. So with that, I think I hope it's all clear, and welcome to everybody. And I'd love to hand over now to Marie Christine to introduce the speaker, and thank you very much to Amy as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to say that with the Friends programme of lectures, we do encourage attendees to consider making a small gift as a way of thanking our speakers that they have freely devoted to the time that they've freely devoted to preparing their lectures. If you wish to make a donation, you can currently see on your screen in the chat box a link for donations through our website page. And now turning to our extremely eminent speaker tonight, Professor Bogaard graduated summa cum laude from Bryn Mawr in the United States before moving to Sheffield to do an MSc and a PhD. She was a lecturer in archaeological science at Nottingham University before moving to Oxford to become a lecturer in Bronze Age archaeology. She then became Professor of Neolithic and Bronze Age archaeology in the School of Archaeology at Oxford before becoming the Professor of European Archaeology and a Fellow of Keble College earlier this year. She has been a Fellow of the British Academy since 2020. Professor Bogaard's research focus is early farming in Europe and Western Asia, from farming origins to early cities, with a particular interest in how farming practice relates to storage systems, diet, inequality, and sustainability. Her current projects include EXPLO, exploring the dynamics and causes of prehistoric land use change in the cradle of European farming, AgriCurve, the agricultural origins of urban civilization, and the Knossos Gypsadis project. She's published widely, and her publications are far too numerous to mention here. Suffice it to say that the list of those of the last 5 years runs to almost 6 pages. Please may I now invite Professor Bogaard to give her lecture on archaeology and eco-cultural heritage, case studies from Greece and beyond. Professor Bogaard.
Well, thank you very much, Marie-Christine, for that incredibly generous introduction. I don't recognize myself whatsoever. And I'm delighted to be here and speaking to the BSA Friends community. So thank you very much also to Flora Michalaki for making the arrangements.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to begin with this photo, which is a view over the southeastern shore of Lake Orestias in Western Greek Macedonia. So the city of Kastoria is off to the left of this photo. And this image captures the setting of the archaeological site of Dispilio, which is a Neolithic to Bronze Age settlement and a long-term project of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. We can also see in the photo in the foreground part of the modern village of Dispilio, its gardens and groves, and diverse habitats shaped by long-term human activity. This includes eutrophication, so enrichment of the lake water, which is part of the cause of the development of these thick reed beds that you can see running along the lakeshore. But the abundance of reeds also reflects a reduction in recent years of the management and seasonal cutting of reeds for construction and craft and fodder, which was a traditional practice in this region. Well, conventional academic investigation of this complex human historical ecosystem would be to understand it by carving it up into parts. And those parts might be cultural and biological or natural and also geological components. This is essentially what happens on an archaeological excavation in microcosm. We recover diverse forms of evidence that are then studied by a range of people with relevant specialist knowledge. What's very unusual is how in archaeology, we endeavor to weave those strands back together to build a holistic understanding. And what I'll try to demonstrate in this talk is that this distinctively archaeological commitment to putting the picture back together again, that is achieving more than the sum of the parts, is a necessary agenda for the wider field of heritage that is more relevant now than ever in an age of ecological crisis. To make this case, I'll step back for a moment to think about how an extended or broadened concept of heritage could reframe and reset thinking about the climate and biodiversity emergencies. So decades of research in earth sciences and in ecology have shown conclusively that human activity has come to shape many of Earth's processes, some permanently, justifying the formal definition, which is an ongoing process, of the Anthropocene as a chronostratigraphic unit and an era in geological time. Current discussion is around different candidate sites around the world to define the Anthropocene in this technical chronostratigraphic sense, and that's what's being captured in the map here. So the cutting edge science is no longer to demonstrate that the Anthropocene is here, it's to figure out what we do about it. And those of us in heritage-facing disciplines or past-facing disciplines know that there is a huge archive of human experience that we can draw upon to model and to build alternative futures. There's also an awareness that our human curiosity and fascination with the past can be part of the solution. That is, that in revisiting our understandings of the past, whether that's the remote, deep past or whether it's quite recent events, we can refresh notions of how we got to where we are, how inevitable the path that we're on is, and to imagine different futures. Well, given this broad potential for heritage to contribute to this whole debate, I'd like to consider briefly how World Heritage value is designated by UNESCO. And I'm emboldened here by Lynn Meskel's thoughtful and critical history of how World Heritage listing emerged and evolved in the later 20th century and until today, becoming increasingly distanced from the archaeologically informed and utopian vision that originally spurred it on. Well, here are some well-known examples to get us thinking about heritage value as designated by UNESCO. So on the left, we have the Great Barrier Reef, which is on the World Heritage List on natural criteria, while Rapa Nui on the right-hand side is listed on cultural criteria. These examples are perhaps not surprising, but on closer inspection, the classification as natural or cultural becomes quite arbitrary. So the Great Barrier Reef is, after all, a region of very long-term human interaction with the wider ecosystem. It was part of the sea country of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for millennia, while Rapa Nui, as the most remote inhabited island on Earth, has become a focus of ecological discussion about long-term sustainability. Well, let's consider a well-known European example, and I'm looking here at the alpine pile dwellings, which are listed on cultural criteria. And here they are in the circumalpine region. But part of what makes them really extraordinary is the preserved organic evidence for how these late prehistoric human communities were embedded in a wider ecosystem. And now I'd like to turn to another area of prehistoric pile-dwelling archaeology in southeastern Europe around Lake Ohrid. Now, Ohrid is unusual in having a dual designation on the World Heritage List. It was first inscribed for its nature conservation value in 1979. And you may know that Lake Ohrid is a very, very ancient lake. It's 2 to 3 million years old and home to a range of endemic species. It was subsequently inscribed for its cultural heritage value in 1980. And in 2019, this dual designation was extended from North Macedonia to Albania, so covering all of Lake Ohrid. And here too, part of its cultural heritage value is pile-dwelling archaeology. And in Lake Ohrid, this has been rather less well known than the pile dwellings of the Alpine region. And I'll come back to some of that archaeology and recent research there a bit later. So attempts to classify heritage at its value as ostensibly cultural or natural clearly insist on human culture as sitting outside of nature. And that same perspective is in fact a symptom of the present crisis, and one that archaeology and its long-term view can help us to question and unlearn. There have been various attempts to reintegrate cultural and natural heritage or aspects thereof. And here is an example. This is from the IIED, which is a London-based research organization focused on the global South. And I've pulled out a quote here on biocultural heritage, which they situate specifically in the context of Indigenous communities and their living heritage. Now, in the title of my talk today, I used the term ecocultural, and I must admit that that is something of a neologism. It is less widely used than biocultural, but on the other hand, there is scope for application beyond present day or specifically Indigenous contexts and into deeper time. And ecocultural is a term used, for example, by the geographer Caitlin de Silva, who is conjuring then a sense of heritage that extends beyond the human, that there is also a heritage of non-human individuals, including plants in her example. But what I'm interested in here is stretching the term ecocultural or biocultural, if you prefer, to capture heritage that is neither natural nor cultural, but resolutely both at the same time. Well, we've talked a little bit about the heritage side of the UN's work through UNESCO. It is also, of course, active on the climate and biodiversity fronts. And as you will be aware, the next climate COP, COP28, is in Dubai and starting next week. Well, what about the UN's work on biodiversity, and how does this articulate with heritage? And I thought I would focus here on biodiversity, given that the media interest in the climate COPs already gives us quite a lot of information. And so my focus here will be on the UN's work, and specifically the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, which is its legal instrument in the area of biological diversity. It was signed in 1992, and the parties to that agreement are the countries which have signed up to it, which is virtually all countries have signed up to the CBD. Now, the current framework is something that I'll come back to, the current agreement on how this instrument should be used. But up until 2020, we had the Aichi biodiversity targets. And the biodiversity agreements of the UN are well known, or rather notorious, for setting targets that are vaguely worded and not met. And the Aichi targets, which were targets agreed in Japan in 2010, which were in force until 2020, those were agreed and then to be implemented through national strategies. And those national strategies by the various countries that had signed up to the convention were drawn up, but most were not fully operationalized. And indeed, no country was deemed by the UN in its own assessment to have met all of the targets by 2020. So a key approach in last year's biodiversity COP, the one in December 2022 in Montreal, was to learn from that failure and to bash out wording, to work out an agreement that was more explicit and held countries to account in a quantifiable way. And that history of failure in the area of biodiversity and meeting targets also suggests that more of a joined-up effort is needed also on the academic and research side. And the question is, how exactly can we contribute, or should we contribute, from a heritage position? So COP15, which was the most recent biodiversity conference of the parties being the governments that have ratified the convention, as I've mentioned, met most recently in Montreal in December 22. And I'll just mention briefly also that parties to this agreement meet every 2 years to review progress, set priorities, commit to work plans. But there is no real enforcement at the international level. The UN now, as you know, defines itself as an intergovernmental organization that can set programs and thresholds, but it is down to national governments to enforce them in law. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I had the experience of being an observer at COP15, which is partly how I got interested in this process and in how the negotiations actually work. I was not there on my archaeological credentials. I was there because I volunteered to go as part of the Oxford delegation. Oxford University has a biodiversity network, and there was a general call across the network for those who were interested in going to freezing Montreal in December. And each of us in the delegation had a particular interest in different aspects of this biodiversity work. There were others, for example, interested in genetic modification or in particular initiatives. My focus was on agricultural aspects of the negotiations, and part of my learning from this experience, which through this talk I'm going to try and bring back to archaeology, was coming very much from the perspective of the agricultural events and negotiations at COP15. So as you will know, I'm sure, the headline from this meeting was that a new agreement was signed, setting targets for 2030, so for the next decade, and those replace the Aichi targets on which all countries, in fact, had failed previously. And this is known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And in the next couple of slides, I've simply done some screenshots of some of the text because I want to draw your attention to certain aspects, but only briefly. So there are 4 goals, which are broader aims for which there is a longer term time frame. So this is aiming for 2050. And then that's followed by 23 targets, which are aimed for 2030. And one just very simple point I wanted to make is that though one might think of biodiversity and nature as having to do with something other than agriculture, in fact, it is front and center, and I've boxed some of the relevant text in Goal A, that maintaining genetic diversity in, as it says here, populations of wild and domestic species is in fact one of the absolutely key goals, and I'll be coming back to that a little bit later. So of those 23 targets, we're not going to go through them all, you'll be relieved to know, but again, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of key ones. And one of the targets that got the most attention in the media was the so-called 30 by 30 target. That is the goal of ensuring that by 2030, at least 30% of land and sea is under effective conservation. So that was a significant increase of a similar goal from the Aichi targets, up to 30%. This was also the first time that there had been explicit mention of the knowledge and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in that particular context, which you'll see is also part of the text of Target 3. Target 3, as I've mentioned, had a previous lower threshold sort of existence in the Aichi targets, and is at least distantly inspired by the E.O. Wilson idea of half Earth, that part of the solution is to set aside a significant chunk of the planet to recover ecologically. But many of the other targets are actually focused on what happens in the other 70% of the Earth's surface. And that, of course, then includes a lot of thinking about agriculture and food production. And I have highlighted here under targets 10 and 11 some of the relevant text that was a focus of the negotiations that I was able to observe. So there was a lot of discussion and argument and different alliances built between different countries about what wording would actually make it in here. So certain countries were very much in favor, for example, of sustainable intensification. It isn't quite clear what that means. Others were very in favor of using the term agroecology, which is a kind of notion of thinking of agricultural systems in an explicitly ecological way and about their sustainability. There is also use of the term here in Target 11 of nature-based solutions. And I wanted to draw that out in part because if that is a concept that you've perhaps come across before, and if you look at its explicit definition, nature-based solutions are defined as actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage. I'll spare you some of the text resources, which addressed social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefits. That's all a bit of a mouthful. One of the interesting aspects of nature-based solutions from my perspective is that many of the examples in the literature are inspired by ethnography, by history, and even from archaeology. So what is happening post COP15 in terms of implementation? So we now have 10 years to actually enact these agreements and these targets, to operationalize them. And I thought I would just briefly mention, this is the last bit of policy in my talk, I promise, but just briefly mention what is happening in the UK and how that works. So the UK statutory advisor to the government on what it should do to meet these targets is called the JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. And it's part of its recent activity has included a new research strategy to coincide with the agreement at COP15. And I wanted to draw your attention in the lower right-hand corner of the slide to the emphasis that is placed on innovation and advancement in learning. and that needs to include taking an interdisciplinary approach to developing solutions. And as it happens, the CEO of the JNCC, whose name is Gemma Harper, is all about social science solutions to natural science problems, and is herself coming from a social science background. So in light of some of this information, how can we think about heritage and positioning the kind of rich evidence that we have from heritage towards that kind of policy landscape? Well, there are no simple answers here. It is a big challenge, but sort of midway through my talk now, I wanted to share some thoughts coming out of that experience of being an observer at COP15. But I want to assure you that I will come back to some archaeology, having gone through some of these points. So one, I'm sure these are all fairly obvious, but one particularly obvious point that came across to me is that we need to be able to tell relevant stories about the past. For example, it could be past agrobiodiversity. Those could be framed as lessons, as cautionary tales, as success stories. But above all, we need to be able to communicate the evidence on which it is all based. There's a great big emphasis in the advice that is given to the parties to the negotiations in the empirical basis of these ideas. So we really, really need to be able to communicate and distill the evidence. Another challenge is that we need to be able to translate from our disciplinary jargon into the current terminology of these debates. And you've already seen some of that terminology in what I've showed so far. So agroecology, certainly resilience, also specific methods of genetic diversity conservation in agriculture often focus on seed systems. And that's something that those of us on the plant side of archaeology need to think about. A third point is that we need to think about pretty broad collaborations, so beyond our comfort zone or beyond at least the academic zone, thinking about agricultural cooperatives, agricultural chambers of commerce, non-governmental organizations who have relevant interests. This is to amplify the voice and the message that we want to communicate. And a fourth point is that post-COP15 and thinking about implementation and towards the next COP in 2024, it's about thinking about scales of engagement. Those could be very local, they could be national, they could be international, and probably just being alive to opportunities that may arise at those different scales. So that's the policy part of the talk. And what I hope will be a sort of stimulating background to what I now want to return to in terms of heritage and archaeology, and specifically some of those pile dwelling sites that I mentioned before. And the area of Lake Ohrid, which has that unusual natural and cultural heritage designation that I mentioned earlier, is part of the study area of a project that has this acronym EXPLO, and its study region. And I'd like to say now a bit about EXPLO and how some of the evidence and learning from that project could be brought to bear on some of these bigger issues. So the EXPLO project is a European Research Council funded synergy project. That means that there are multiple PIs at different institutions. And so this is a collaboration between the University of Bern in Switzerland, Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and the University of Oxford. The project has been running since 2019. It finishes in 2025, and we are in the thick of it right now. And I'll come back in a moment to some of the work of the team that is based here in Oxford. But first, and to help set the scene for this project, here is a map to summarize where we are and to focus in on some of the archaeological sites. So Dispilio in the south and the sites of Ploče Mitrovgrad and Lin 3 on Lake Ohrid that have become the particular focal points of excavation and very intensive post-excavation analysis as part of this project. And you can see on the right-hand side, views of the lakeshore settings of these various sites, and I'll be coming back to the sites in due course. But first, and to help set the scene a little bit further for what some of the particular climatic and ecological factors are that are important for thinking about the Explo study region. In fact, this is an area that's very interesting from the perspective of the spread of the Neolithic, so Neolithization, the spread of farming, and agroecology, meaning here simply the ecology of the actual practice of how people are carrying out cultivation and herding. So the Explo study region, which I've just boxed in red here, lies on the edge of the 7th millennium initial Neolithic site distribution. And that's the kind of reddish colored splodge in this map. And that initial 7th millennium, so 6000s BC site distribution, is focused on the mildest Mediterranean climate zone, and that is shown in this map with the diagonal shading. So it seems that the initial spread of the Neolithic is confined to relatively mild Mediterranean conditions for the first centuries of farming in this part of Europe. Then from about 6000 BC, we see an onward spread up into the lower and middle Danube valleys, and part of that is what you see in the yellow shading towards the top of the map. So there are two particular pulses of Neolithic spread that are summarized here. And what I want to draw your attention to is that Explo with Lake Ohrid and the region that we've been describing is just off to the edge of this mild Mediterranean zone, just outside it. And part of the recent discussion in sort of Neolithic studies of this region is that those two episodes are separated by a climate event called the 8.2 K event, so dating to about then 6200 BC, which is one of the most pronounced Holocene cold and arid events. And the thinking is, the inference has been that the onward spread of farming beyond this mildest zone coincides with conditions becoming warmer and wetter. And another way of sort of expressing this is to look at the distribution of different, typically Mediterranean crops, tree crops. So looking at olive and fig and grape. Those are the three thresholds that are shown here. And so the thinking is that part of the slowdown in the spread of the Neolithic is encountering zones where these sorts of typical Mediterranean taxa are ceasing to thrive, and that's part of what distinguishes those different pulses of Neolithic settlement. And you can see that the Explo study region is in fact lying between the limits for olive and fig to the south and east, and grape a little bit further north. So a hypothesis then from this previous thinking would be that the eventual Neolithization of these upland lakeshore settings is to do with this adaptation to climate change, the shift to warmer and wetter conditions post 8.2 before present. So a question then, a logical question arising from that, how was this achieved and what can we learn from it? So just another bit of scene setting before I plunge into a bit more detail from Explo, and that is that what Explo really confronts us with is what I've dubbed here the wet Neolithic. That is the Neolithic that is preserved under high groundwater levels, enabling much greater preservation of organic material and biomolecular information than is typical under dry, as it were, normal site conditions. So much of what we know about the Neolithic of Southeast Europe is from the dry Neolithic, often though from sites that were originally in a wetland setting, but have since been drained or dried out. whereas XBLO is enabling us to look at what is preserved under anaerobic conditions and high groundwater levels. And the question becomes, are these dry and wet Neolithics in fact two sides of the same coin? So just to acknowledge that we have a fabulous team working together in Oxford, and that everything interesting that I have to say about results coming out of XBLO, and I won't have time to say that much, is thanks to the work of this group. And that if you would like to delve into further detail of what we're learning about in XBLO, there will be another lecture in January in the Mycenaean series where we will delve further. So our focus in Oxford in the XBLO project is on the archaeobotany and also on the faunal remains. And it's particularly on the botanical, on the plant side of things, that I'll try to give you a flavor of the kind of data we are recovering. This is just to remind you again of the sites and their lakeshore settings, variously on Lake Orestias, in the case of Dispilio, and then on either side of Lake Ohrid at Lin 3 and at Plocha Mitrovgrad. We are learning more and more about the chronology of these sites, and that is the focus, in fact, of one of the teams at the University of Bern, is the dendrochronology. And on the right-hand side of this slide are some examples of the detailed information that we can gain from the dating of the piles themselves, that is the vertical timbers on which houses and platforms were supported at the lakeshore, and giving us, in some cases, year-specific accuracy in our ability to date those construction events, and then through radiocarbon correlation, dating of the associated occupation levels. And so overall, from the dendrochronology and also from radiocarbon dating that we've been doing here in Oxford, it's becoming increasingly clear that all of these lakeshore sites begin in the earlier part of the 6th millennium BC, so the early 5000s BC. And it seems that we should see this as part of the dispersal and agency of the household, of new Neolithic communities forming, and of their interest in ecotonal advantages of living on the lake shore, that is, access both to aquatic and terrestrial opportunities and resources. Dispilio is an example I will look at briefly, and of course had been the focus of decades of excavation and research prior to XBLO, and much of what we know about the site, of course, is from that long-term interest of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Dispilio in its Neolithic phases dates to the 6th millennium BC and has furnished a very rich and diverse material culture of what you could call the mature Neolithic, so the middle and mostly the late Neolithic in the later part of the 6th millennium BC. In biological terms, or in botanical terms, we have a wealth of plant data emerging from this research, and in particular from the lower layers, the sort of chocolatey brown layers that you can see in the section in the lower right-hand corner, just as an example, we are finding not only charred but also uncharred plant material. And so this is giving us a possibility to consider not only what would be preserved typically on dry sites in charred form, but also what is preserved under these high groundwater levels in uncharred form. And interestingly, what we find in uncharred form does include a lot of crop material, so that corroborates the crop richness of the charred assemblage. There is certainly a lot of processing and consumption of cereals and pulses going on. But what we also find in uncharred form is a whole range of evidence for foraging, that is, collection of fruits and nuts and other plant foods, edible foods, what you could call kind of hedgerow food. And indeed, these hedgerow-like habitats may in fact be managed. So it may be too simple to think of these as wild, but they are certainly perennials and diversifying the plant food spectrum beyond the annual crops, the cereals and pulses that we tend to associate with the Neolithic. And I would like to briefly zoom in on one of the crops that we find. It's a kind of wheat that is extinct now. Its name is Timofeves wheat, or in Latin, Triticum timofevi. And I wanted to mention this briefly because it is a crop that was lost in the sense that it was hardly known or cultivated at all by the early 20th century. It was only known from cultivation in a handful of villages in Western Georgia in the Caucasus, and that's where it was discovered and named Triticum timofevi. But it turns out from recent archaeobotanical research that in fact this was one of the founder crops of the Neolithic. It seems to have emerged in Western Asia and was certainly of great interest to communities in Anatolia, so on the western part of Asia, and spread with einkorn and emmer and other familiar Neolithic crops into Europe. And this map is from a recent publication that is summarizing finds of this now rediscovered kind of wheat. And I want also to acknowledge the foundational role of archaeobotanical research in Greece by Glynis Jones and Sultana Valamotti, and also Mike Charles, in establishing this morphotype archaeobotanically before it was even clear what the Latin name was. But subsequently that has been corroborated both through ancient DNA study and also more recently geometric morphometric analysis of grain shape, that this is Triticum timofevi and that there has been another wheat then that was part of the Neolithic Western Eurasian story. Now, interestingly, Triticum timofevi had already played a role in modern crop breeding. It had been, its genes rather, had been introduced into modern bread wheat in the mid to later 20th century because those genes were found to confer resistance to fungal diseases such as stem rust and leaf rust. So if it seems to you like science fiction that an ancient wheat could actually inform future food security and improve crop performance, in a sense it has already happened. It's just that we didn't know that Triticum timofevi was such an important ancient crop as we do now. That interdisciplinary potential is demonstrated further, for example, by the way in which the emerging long-term archaeological record for Triticum timofevi as a prehistoric crop has brought it again to the attention of crop scientists working on genetics and diversity and neglected crop progenitors and the breeding of new crop characteristics. And that's where this article sort of came from, that interdisciplinary discussion. And that new interest from crop science in Timofeves wheat is emerging in the context of long-term declines in the yields of elite crop breeds that demand huge inputs of mineral fertilizer and water, which in turn accelerate climate change. So back to Dispilio briefly, and from a plant perspective, the wet and dry Neolithic essentially boils down to this contrast, which I've summarized here with a couple of pie charts. And this is based on work by Mirge Ergun and Jenny Gatsogia, who are postdoctoral researchers on Explo. So what we typically see on dry Neolithic sites is what you see in the right-hand pie chart, where virtually the entire assemblage is crops. What we see in the uncharred assemblage, thanks to waterlogged preservation at Dispilio on the left-hand side, gives us a much more balanced picture. So crops are still important, but foraged plants are also very prominent in the assemblage. This is the fruit and nut component. And so that fruit and nut, that foraging component, is normally just not visible on dry Neolithic sites. And this is just looking at some of that foraging activity in a bit more taxonomic detail. So part of what we can pick up here is how early farmers adapted their foraging practices beyond the mildest Mediterranean zone. So we pick up some classic Mediterranean taxa like almond and terebinth and fig, but we also find less Mediterranean taxa, more temperate European taxa, such as hazelnut, apple, and pear in this transitional climate zone. So we have then plenty of evidence for a diverse plant food spectrum beyond the crops that are taken to define the Neolithic. So from the other Explo sites, which I obviously won't in my time remaining dwell in great detail upon, but from all of the sites, we are getting a similar picture of great plant food diversity. And these excavations at the other sites, as well as at Dispelio itself, also pose all kinds of opportunities to think about recent history and the modern context and interest in lakeshore dwelling and lakeshore settlement and Neolithic farming. So at Dispelio, for example, Paul Halstead is conducting ethnographic work to investigate recent lakeshore vegetation management, fishing, and animal husbandry as a lens for considering differences in Neolithic practice. And that's a work in progress that we're all hugely interested in. I'm going to look briefly and in near conclusion to my talk at the settlement of Linn 3, which is on the Albanian side of Lake Ohrid. And I'd like to conclude with some images. This is from Linn 3, which are conjuring up some of this interdisciplinary potential. Now, Linn 3 has been the subject of underwater and also terrestrial shoreline excavation as part of the Explo project. And these are images that I'll share with you that are mostly from June this year, when that terrestrial excavation was expanded, building on previous coring and test trenching, including underwater. So rich cultural layers are associated with concentrations of vertical piles. And this is very informal, but I've included a snapshot that I'm gesturing to now with my cursor, which will just look like a series of muddy lumps. But in fact, this is fruit stones, a nutshell. This is part of the muesli that is just pouring out of this cultural layer and is preserved under waterlogged conditions. So this includes cornelian cherry, acorn, and grape, for example. And I should stress that the botanical and faunal material is still to be formally assessed. But there's also interest, of course, in considering the local setting and scope for comparative work on contemporary farming at Linn. And I've just assembled some images here to try and give you a sense of that potential. There's a lot of intensive gardening nowadays along the lake edge. There are also strip fields, which have an interesting history in the region, extending away from the lake shore. And those strip fields are managed by rotation of cereals and maize and legumes and hay crops, and also some vegetables and periods of grazed fallow. Though there is some use of agrochemicals in the vicinity, what's remarkable when you look at the crop fields near the excavation at Linn is that they preserve many of the traditional cereal weeds that are very uncommon nowadays in Europe. There are also areas of vineyards surrounded by hedges with fruit and nut trees, which are managed and intensively used. There's also, always of interest to me, lots of manuring in evidence. And you can see an example of that in the lower left-hand part of this slide. This is from stabling of milk cows and sheep and goats in the nearby villages. So it's just very unusual to have this array of practice and with limited use of agrochemicals directly adjacent to excavation, and it begs the whole question of how this system has evolved over the very long term. There is also in the vicinity of Linn 3 some nice stands of wild einkorn wheat. This is a progenitor of domesticated, or the progenitor of domesticated einkorn, and growing as a roadside ruderal, not as an arable weed. And so an opportunity here also to explore that wild cereal habitat. So all in all, plenty of opportunities to extend studies, including but also beyond excavation and recovery, to the bigger contemporary picture and its ecocultural heritage interest for local and wider communities. And so very near the end of the talk now, but coming back briefly to some of the points I raised earlier about how we can contribute from a heritage perspective, the relevant stories from Explo will certainly include high plant diversity, both within the crop spectrum and including crops that are now extinct, like Triticum timophoeves wheat, but also beyond the crops to that diverse forage spectrum. There's also an interesting resonance and, of course, very obvious differences with contemporary farming practice in the region. There's the challenge of translating to current terminology. So how can we compare the agroecology of past and present? How can we emphasize long-term biodiversity, now, of course, including Western Hemisphere crops such as maize in the local agricultural system. And the next steps then in that process would be forming those collaborations and integrating those collaborative goals in our work on implementation of biodiversity targets, including those that filter down from the UN's biodiversity agreements. And just one concluding thought, if I may, the prehistoric archaeology of Greece and surrounding regions is positioned to lead the way into increasingly interdisciplinary studies of past and present human ecology. And two of the inspirational texts that we can look to here are shown on the screen. So Paul Halstead's book, Two Oxen Ahead, and from this year, Tanya Sultana-Valamoti's book, Plant Foods of Greece, which also gives us culinary inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Amy. That was absolutely fascinating, a real eye-opener. Before I just ask for any questions, could I just run through the question and answer feature again so that everybody knows how to use it? The feature looks like two speech bubbles, one on top of the other, into which you can type questions for the speaker, and only you, the speaker, and myself will be able to see these. I'll read out a selection of the questions received. You should see a small window in the top right of your screen. If this gets in your way, you can mouse over it and either move it around your screen, or you can click on the bars above to make it smaller. So, well, our first comment is from Bill Kavanagh, who says, "Wonderful talk, Amy," which is very nice. If I could possibly ask a question, I wanted to ask Amy, how optimistic are you that you will be able to communicate these amazing finds and things, and that will help to reach the targets such as 3030? I'm talking about you personally, obviously.
Well, I think the honest answer is it's not about me personally. It is about our collective will to try and distill these messages and communicate as a group, and of course in collaboration with others beyond our discipline. So the question you're asking is exactly what occurs to one as an observer at one of these events, because you just realize that there is huge diplomatic and political and technocratic machinery that lies between you and action. And so if we want to engage, we would need to engage at scale. And this is why the optimism that I have stems from the wealth of research, particularly in Greece and in the prehistoric archaeology of Greece and in comparative work between present and past. So if that movement is going to start anywhere, this would be the right part of the world.
And sorry, I'm just going to ask a subsidiary question since I'm sitting here. And that is, who really would be the main targets of people that you would want to communicate this to? Because I see that in your talk, you talked about farmers, etc., etc., etc. It seems to me also there's a need to communicate also to a corporate side.
No, I think you're right. And this is where, I realize this will be part of the experience that you bring to this conversation, is understanding that corporate side and how to engage. And so there will be skills in communicating to different audiences. There won't be a single target audience. But I think one of the first steps is to clarify that the process of learning that I've been through in the last year is just understanding enough about the process to see what the terms of the debate and the terms of the discussion are, and then engaging with communities, very diverse communities, from corporate to farmer to academic to students to, consumers. And part of that spectrum is what is expressed in, the range of work. I'm thinking of Sultana Valamoti's book, Plant Foods of Greece, that came out this year, and the kind of media attention and interest in her work in Greece. So I think there are grounds for optimism in the interest that the public has in the past and in learning more about the past and how that can inspire new ideas for the future. So we would be relying on a wider collective optimism beyond our discipline.
Fair enough. There's a question from Bill Kavanagh. He says, could you reflect on the interrelation of communities, for example, in the light of human ADNA?
Yes, no, that's a great question, Bill. Thank you very much. So as you will be aware, and as Bill is drawing our attention to, that rich story of human demographic movement that we now have from ancient DNA shows us how new ideas, technologies, recipes are moving around all the time. And so I think there is a really profound message about migration and the arrival of new ideas and the uptake of new ideas in unfamiliar circumstances that would certainly resonate today, and that we could try to deploy in broadening people's interest beyond, a very narrow food range that has become so normative in much of Europe and certainly much of the UK, to get people interested in new foods that are also stemming from communities that are part of the UK and have that greater diversity that they can bring literally to the table, but also agrobiodiversity to our food systems.
And there's a question from Sir Adam Ridley. He says, how would you summarize the intellectual product you expect from Explo?
Oh, thank you for another interesting question. I mean, my ambition would be, yes, there need to be the usual armada of articles and peer-reviewed publications and lots of data and open access that other people can build on. But I do feel on some of the fronts, in particular plant diversity and thinking beyond the immediate range of Neolithic crops that I've emphasized in this talk, that another ambition we should have amongst those outputs is to try and reach this broader audience and to think about how to engage with people who aren't necessarily consumers of academic archaeological output, but are interested in food security and sustainability, and engaging and drawing people in new ways from these results. So that's very much something I think as an Explo team we need to think about.
Well, I just want to say, before I say thank you myself, that there's a stream of thank yous. Thank you for a most enlightened presentation. Brilliant stuff, Amy. Many thanks. That's from John Bennett. And to those, Amy, I want to add my own thanks for everybody who's been listening to this. It's been a totally fascinating and really illuminating talk. So thank you very, very much for giving us your time.
Oh, it's an honor. Thank you so much for asking. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks.
Cheers.
Goodbye, everybody.